All right, we are continuing our study of the Gospel of Matthew here on the Listener's Commentary. And in this recording, we're going to be looking at Matthew chapter 19, verses 1 through 12. This section opens up with the words that Matthew has regularly used to indicate that he's transitioning out of a teaching block and into a narrative section. And so, over the next couple of chapters, we're going to look at Jesus and some snapshots from his life as he and his disciples head out of Galilee and down south towards Judea and Jerusalem for their final Passover. And what we'll see is the snapshots that Matthew puts together in this section, just as it's been his pattern throughout the gospel. These snapshots will continue to reflect the themes of the teaching block in chapter 18. And the central theme of that teaching block was status and relationships. And so these snapshots here will have things about relationships. And it begins in this section, 9, 1 through 12, with a teaching about marriage and divorce. And it's actually brought about by a question of some Pharisees. In fact, this is the only mention of the Pharisees clear from chapter 16, verse 21, all the way up to chapter 20. And so it reminds us that the Pharisees are still there. They're still in the background. They're still opposed to Jesus, and they're still challenging him and testing him. And that'll be important because when he gets to Jerusalem, the Pharisees are going to be at the center of the conflict that Jesus has with them that eventually leads to his crucifixion. And so here, these Pharisees ask Jesus a question about marriage and divorce, and that's completely in sync with the themes of this teaching block that we just wrapped up about relationships, in this case, the relationship of marriage. And so here's how the section opens. Chapter 19, verse 1 says, "When Jesus had finished these words," that is when he wrapped up that teaching section, "he left Galilee." So Galilee in Matthew's gospel is where most of Jesus' ministry has been focused. And now he's going to leave that and he's going to head south for what will be his final Passover. And so he left Galilee and came into the region of Judea beyond the Jordan, and large crowds followed him, and he healed them there. So he heads out of Galilee and he heads south, and he comes to what Matthew terms here as the region of Judea beyond the Jordan. That's actually a little bit challenging because technically the region beyond the Jordan refers to Perea, that is the region east of the Jordan River, whereas Judea refers to the region west of the Jordan River. And the next specific place mentioned in Matthew's gospel is Matthew chapter 20, verse 29, which refers to the city of Jericho. Jericho is just across the Jordan River into the region of Judea. So it seems likely that Matthew is simply speaking a bit generic here, or general, where just talking about Jesus heading to Judea and he's going down through the region of Perea on the east side of the Jordan River. And he seems to spend some time there. Large crowds followed him. He healed them there. So as he's making his way to Jerusalem for his final Passover, he spends some time along the eastern side of the Jordan River on the way there. And Matthew then shares a snapshot from Jesus' time in that region. And so look what happens in verse 3. Some Pharisees came to Jesus, testing him. Notice that, just to remind us, they're there. They're opposed to him. They're still trying to trick him and trap him. So they come testing him and asking, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any reason at all?" And the reality was there was a raging debate among the Jewish teachers of the day about this topic of divorce. And what they were doing was they were wrestling with the meaning and application of the one key passage about divorce in all of the Torah and all of the law. That passage shows up in what we refer to as Deuteronomy 24:1. Here's the way it reads. Deuteronomy 24:1 says, "When a man takes a wife and marries her, and it happens if she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some indecency in her, that he writes her a certificate of divorce, puts it in her hand, and sends her away." And then the passage goes on from there. The key phrase they're debating is that phrase right in the middle, "found some indecency in her." Well, what qualifies as some indecency? And that's where the raging debate of the day came from. And there were really two main schools of thought. There was the school of thought of the Rabbi Shammai and the school of thought of the Rabbi Hillel. Shammai was the more conservative of the two and said that only the case of adultery really qualifies as some indecency. Hillel, on the other hand, allowed for divorce for virtually any reason at all. And it seems that the more casual view of divorce in the school of Hillel was the more common view among the men of the day. In fact, the Wisdom of Ben Sirach, an intertestamental book written about 150 years before the time of Jesus, Sirach advised divorce if your wife just didn't follow your directions. The contemporary of the Apostle Paul, Josephus, he divorced his wife because he just wasn't pleased with her behavior anymore. And so it seems easy divorce was the fairly common approach of the day, at least of those who were in positions of authority and power. So they're asking Jesus to weigh in on this debate and to give his opinion on the matter. And what we'll see as we listen to Jesus' teaching, Jesus clearly lands on the more conservative side with the school of Shammai. But he does so by initially challenging the entire premise of the debate. They're looking for excuses to end their marriage, and Jesus challenges them to say you should actually look at God's intent for marriage altogether. So they ask this question of Jesus, testing him, and here's how Jesus answered in verse 4. He says, "And he answered and said, have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female and said, for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh." Jesus, in other words, harkens all the way back to the beginning, way back to when God first invented marriage and says, what's God's design for marriage? And I find it a little bit of, maybe even a little bit of a jab in some regards from Jesus when he says, haven't you read? Haven't you read? Like, you guys are Pharisees, you're religious leaders, you're the teachers of the law. Haven't you read what the law actually says? And he harkens all the way back then to that very beginning out of Genesis chapter 2. And what he says is God designed marriage to operate a specific way. And we see that here in this quote from Genesis 2. Marriage is to be between a male and a female. He says that. Marriage involves male and female becoming one together, one flesh, and marriage forms a new family. They're going to leave father and mother and be joined together and become new flesh. And so the point Jesus is making in this context is simply this: a divorce, any divorce, even if there's a legitimate reason for that divorce, it reveals a failure somewhere along the lines of God's intent and God's purpose for marriage. And frankly, that's why divorce hurts so much, right? Because it's not the way it's supposed to be. And that's Jesus' point. When God invented marriage, there's a way it's supposed to be, and it's supposed to be this covenant union between male and female that forms this new family and makes them into one flesh. And Jesus, in fact, emphasizes that by restating that last line of the quote from Genesis 2. So look at verse 6. He says, so they are no longer two, but one flesh. They've been so united together that in some sort of way, these two people have now become one. And tearing it apart, therefore, is very painful and very damaging. And so Jesus says, therefore, what God has joined together, no person is to separate. Like, this is God's intent. God has welded these persons together who once were two individuals into one new unit, one new family, and to tear them apart violates God's very design and intent for marriage. And in saying all of this, Jesus is challenging the premise of their question. And I think they get that. And so they push back in verse 7, these Pharisees do. Look what they say. They said to him, well, why then did Moses command to give her a certificate of divorce and send her away? And so I think they're sensing that Jesus is actually undermining the entire premise of their debate. And so they ask from Deuteronomy 24, I mean, like, if what you're saying is true, Jesus, then why this little law in Deuteronomy 24 about giving her a certificate of divorce and sending her away? And what we'll see in Jesus' answer is that he contends Moses wrote that law to regulate a already existing less than ideal practice and situation. So here's Jesus' response to them in verse 8. He said to them, "Because of your hardness of heart, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it hasn't been this way." So let's reflect on what Jesus is saying here in verse 8. Notice he says Moses permitted. They said, "Why did Moses command?" Jesus clarifies, he didn't command, he permitted it, and he gave instructions about it. And it seems like it was motivated by a less than ideal situation. Notice he says, "Because of your hardness of heart, Moses permitted this." In other words, divorce is not anyone's ideal, and it certainly isn't what God intended from the beginning when he designed it. In other words, Moses wrote what he wrote there in Deuteronomy 24 because divorce already existed in the cultures of the ancient Near East. And so there needed to be some law to regulate it, primarily to protect people, particularly the woman, so that her husband couldn't just toss her out with nowhere to turn. So Moses gave this instruction in Deuteronomy 24 as a means of regulating a less than ideal situation. Why? Well, because God designed marriage to operate a certain way, but post Genesis 3, post the fall, we human beings aren't all we're designed to be. Living outside of Eden as we currently are, we have issues. Our hearts are messed up, as Jesus says. They tend to be hard, and we don't always live the way we're designed to operate. And thus, some less than ideal concessions became necessary. And that's what happens with a lot of the laws in the Old Testament. They're regulating less than ideal situations and saying, here's how we should deal with that situation in the best and wisest way we can at this present time. So the instruction of Moses in Deuteronomy 24 about divorce isn't an endorsement of divorce. It's actually seeking to regulate the practice of it to keep a bad situation from getting worse. But as Jesus says, from the beginning, that's not how it was supposed to be. When God first designed marriage, which is to say, marriage is his idea. He knows how it's supposed to operate, and he has a goal for it. And so we need to remember that God's instructions are not arbitrary. They're actually rooted in creation, rooted in the way things are, and rooted in the way things are designed to operate. That's what Jesus is getting at. And so when they push back on this issue from Deuteronomy 24, Jesus is reminding them, look, that's because human beings aren't the way they're supposed to be, but God didn't design marriage to work this way. And so Jesus has now established God's intent for marriage and the really deep relational impact of marriage and thus of divorce. And so now he's ready to answer their specific questions. So look at verse 9. Remember, they asked a question about the reason for divorce. And so Jesus says in verse 9, "And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, and marries another woman commits adultery." Couple observations. Notice this is addressed to the male. They asked about a man divorcing a wife. That command from Deuteronomy 24 puts the responsibility for divorce on the male. And as a matter of fact, in the ancient world, both of Moses' day and Jesus' day, it was the rare exception where a woman might be able to initiate divorce. For the most part, that was a man's prerogative, not a woman. So Jesus is addressing it to the men here in this case because that was the situation of his day. He also says whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality. And that word sexual immorality is a broad word that refers to any sort of illicit sexual activity. And so Jesus limits, like the school of Shammai, he limits the some indecency clause in Deuteronomy 24 to this, to sexual immorality. And he points out that divorce for any other reason than that, divorce for any other reason than sexual immorality, Jesus says, is adultery. It's being unfaithful to your marriage vows. It's violating the oneness that was created by that marriage in the first place. Now, one really important detail that's assumed in what Jesus says and really assumed in this whole conversation, but we can easily miss, and we must be sure we don't miss it, is this. That divorce and remarriage were a single kind of unit or way of thinking in Jesus' day. Here's why that's so important. because in applying this passage to today, some people have sought to separate divorce and remarriage. And they say things like, well, divorce may be permissible in that case, but remarriage is not. But that completely misunderstands the original context. In the ancient world, the whole point of the certificate of divorce mentioned in Deuteronomy 24 was to permit remarriage. That was the whole point of that. Jewish divorce certificates actually included the words, "You're free to remarry any man." So to discuss divorce is also to discuss remarriage. To permit divorce is also to permit remarriage. And so the regulation was actually about freeing up and permitting a woman to remarry, aimed at protecting her. That's why that law was given by Moses. Now she has a certificate of divorce. It frees her to remarry another man and not be labeled an adulteress or a prostitute or something like that. She's free to remarry. And so when Jesus says, here's the legitimate grounds for divorce, it's also the legitimate grounds for remarriage. So now we've seen Jesus' response to this question from these Pharisees. And I assume what follows in verses 10 and following happens maybe a little bit later after the Pharisees have gone away or whatnot. Here's what happens. Verse 10, the disciples said to him, if the relationship of a man with his wife is like this, it's better not to marry. Like, wow, if it's that stringent and that difficult and divorce should be limited to that reason, man, maybe it's better just not to get married at all. That's sort of his disciples' response. And interestingly enough, in verses 11 and following, Jesus doesn't completely reject that sentiment or that statement. Look what he says. Jesus said to them, not all men can accept this statement, but only to those to whom it has been given. In other words, you're not totally off base. It's just that it's not for everybody. There are only some who can actually truly, in a godly sort of way, not get married, such as Jesus himself. And so Jesus explains what he means in verse 12. He says, for, explaining, there are eunuchs, that is, those who refrain from marriage, some of which are eunuchs by castration, some of which are eunuchs because of vocation. And so he says there are eunuchs who were born that way from their mother's wombs. And so there were people who were born as eunuchs, unable to get married, unable to have kids or whatever the situation is. There are some who are eunuchs who were made eunuchs by people. They were castrated. They were put into a position where they had to act as a eunuch or serve as a eunuch. And then Jesus says this, and there are also eunuchs who made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. In other words, there are people who chose celibacy and chose not to get married for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. And Jesus then says, the one who's able to accept this, let him accept it. The one who has that calling, the one who has that vocation and who can live that out in a healthy, godly sort of way, let him accept it, like Jesus did, like the Apostle Paul did, right? They are eunuchs. They are celibate for the sake of the kingdom of heaven and their service to the kingdom of heaven. But that's not for everybody. And so Jesus wants to qualify what the disciples said. Don't just reject marriage outright. Only do it if you're called to that by God and you do it for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. The one who is able to accept this, let him accept it. Now, let's wrap up this section by just some reflection on Jesus' teaching on divorce and marriage here. What we see in Jesus' teaching is the sacredness of marriage, the solemnity of marriage, right? Like this is a serious thing, and it unites two people together to such a way that they now can be described as one flesh. And thus divorce is tearing that apart. And so Jesus is very stringent on what really is a legitimate cause for divorce. And if his thinking on that maybe makes us squirm or makes us want to kind of push back or protest or get upset, we should at least pause and say, maybe Jesus is right. Maybe what he says here explains why divorce more often than not hurts so much and why there are so many natural consequences to divorce, right? That this deep emotional, physical, spiritual oneness of marriage has somehow been violated, and that hurts. In fact, when I was preaching through one of the passages in Jesus' teaching on divorce a number of years ago, I actually gathered a small group of people from the congregation who had experienced divorce. Every single one of them, even those who had legitimate reasons for their divorce, every single one of them said, I would never wish it on anyone. It was more painful than death and these sorts of things. And I think more often than not, that's the case. Um, it destroys something that is sacred. And because divorce is such a personal issue, and because it's usually so painful, we have to bear in mind that Jesus' instruction here and elsewhere is really driven by compassion. It's based on the fact that there really is an objective reality. That is, there's a way things are supposed to be. There's a way things are designed to function in this universe. And that means there's a way marriage is designed to function. And when we violate the way things are meant to be, there's real harm and real brokenness that results. And Jesus, by virtue of his instructions on every topic, including this topic of marriage and divorce, Jesus is trying to protect us from this. And so his instruction is compassionate wisdom given for our good. Divorce is quote unquote wrong, not because of some arbitrary religious law. It's wrong because it violates the way God designed human beings and thus marriage to operate. And it does us real harm. It's like drinking gasoline, right? You don't drink gasoline. Sure, it's a clear liquid, but you don't drink it. Why? Because it does you real harm. Divorce is like that. Violating any of Jesus' commands is like that. But divorce is not the unforgivable sin. And we have to quit talking about it like that as well. What we see is divorce is not the way God intended marriage relationships to work. But we human beings, because of our brokenness and our fallenness, what Jesus refers to as our hardness of heart here in this text, divorce happens. Tragically, marriages come to an end. They don't always go according to God's desires, and they don't always go according to our desires, do they? Right? Who gets married planning on desiring their marriage to end in divorce? Not a single one of us. And that's why when I talk to that group of people, that's why when I continue to pastor and counsel other people whose marriages are falling apart, there's such pain. There's such heartache. Sometimes there's even shame connected to divorce. And those of you who have been through it, you know that. You know how painful it is. You know how difficult it is. And so as the church, we agree with you on that pain. It's not what God intended. And we want to come alongside you that God is compassionate and merciful. And so if your marriage ended in divorce, just remember that it's not the unforgivable sin. And God is a gracious God who delights in mercy and forgiveness. And not only that, he delights in restoring things that got broken and redeeming the fallen, broken parts of our life. And so my prayer is that even if Jesus' teaching here is maybe hard to hear or listen to for some of you, that you remember that God is gracious and God is merciful and God is a God of restoration. All right, thanks for tuning into this session of the Listener's Commentary on the New Testament. The Listener's Commentary is a listener-supported, crowd-funded Bible teaching ministry that's made possible by the generous support of dozens of people just like you. So thanks a ton for your support. And if you have been blessed by this ministry, would you prayerfully consider joining that team of supporters so that this ministry can continue to grow and increase? Let me just mention one little project. We're currently working on an app that will make the commentary much easier to use so you don't have to scroll and scroll and scroll on your podcast player to find whatever Bible book you want to study, because you'll be able to listen to it by Bible books. And it's currently being built out for iOS, that is for Apple products, because of a supporter of the ministry who's an iOS app developer. But we need an Android app developer, and that'll likely cost some money. And so projects like that will help this ministry continue to grow, continue to reach more people, be more useful, and have a bigger impact for the sake of God's kingdom. And so if you have been blessed by this ministry, would you prayerfully consider joining the team of supporters so that projects like that and others can continue to grow and increase the fruit and the impact of this ministry? God bless you, and thank you for your support.